took the tutorial with the remote control here. So, we'll see if it works. And, you know, after yesterday's lecture by Dr. Sykes, I probably fouled up the disclosures. I don't think I had any disclosures related to this talk, but I guess I'm on Speakers Bureau for DAXA, Spectranetics, and we do get fellowship support from a variety of companies. You know, the reason we put in defibrillators is to reduce the risk of sudden cardiac death, to keep people alive. And Dr. Rousseau went through these slides with you yesterday. These are the secondary prevention trials. So these are people who have had a cardiac arrest or sustained VT. And these trials have shown a significant reduction, not just in sudden death, but in overall mortality. There have been a variety of primary prevention trials. So these are trials in individuals who are at risk for sudden cardiac death, but have not had sustained VT or PF. And again, there are a variety of trials which show important reductions, not just in sudden death, but in overall mortality. There are also some trials that have been done which have not necessarily shown reductions in overall mortality. And when I put in the first ICD, participated in putting in the first ICD in this part of the country back in 1986, that was a thoracotomy procedure. So you open the chest, you put these big patches all over the heart. You had monophasic shocks, and typically the device wouldn't work, and you'd have to start rearranging things. And those devices came from the factory with a given rate cutoff, and there was nothing programmable about them that didn't do any pacing. They just provided a shock. And so if you called and said, I want a device with a rate cutoff of 176, and they said, we're out of those, we won't have them for a month, but we can give you one of 162, you go, okay, that's what you can get. So these devices have clearly come a long way. But they were designed to favor sensitivity over specificity. And detections in those devices were very short because charge times were very long. And they began long, 10, 12, 15 seconds, and as the batteries depleted, they would get even longer. So several years ago, I saw a patient in the office, and this was several generations down the line because now the device was programmable and you can interrogate it. And I see that this patient had a 27-second episode of ventricular fibrillation. I go, oh my God, what's wrong with this device? And get out the electrograms, and you look at it, this was the real deal. This was not just something the device was calling in PF. No, this was ugly, bad stuff. And I'm looking, and this was a device that when the battery was depleting, the charge time prolonged, and so it did everything perfectly. And I should have added that it was a 27-second episode of PF with no therapy. And at the same time, the patient was asymptomatic. And basically what happened is that the charge time on this device was so long that just when the charge ended, the arrhythmia actually ended. And therefore no therapy was necessary. That had the device charged up a little faster, I would have looked at the patient and said, what a device saved your life. And as it is, that would have actually been an unnecessary shock. But again, detection times were short when we started, charge times were long, and those early algorithms still remain at the core of really all of the devices that we use that's just beginning to change a little bit. Again, a device-defined arrhythmia is present based on what the device sees and how it's programmed. So it has nothing to do with what is really going on. And if you program the device to call anything over, the major criteria are rate and duration. So if you tell the device that anything over 160 beats per minute is ventricular fibrillation, it doesn't care if it's sinus tachycardia. You get sinus tach at 161 beats per minute, and the device will call it ventricular fibrillation and charge up and deliver therapy. And so this slide will give a little explanation. This is Boston Scientific data. It's from what they call the Altitude study, which is really a series of studies. And Boston Scientific has a remote monitoring service now, so device information is downloaded to the internet, et cetera, and they have made that database available to a pre-selected group of investigators who will decide on interesting things that they should look for in that database. And so what this shows, the white line is if somebody's device is programmed with a single zone with GF detect at 170 beats per minute or less, you can see that these people get a tremendous number of therapies. Approximately 20% of them get a shot within the first year, and that continues to go up. If you have a two-zone device with VT at 170 or less, you can see that they get a considerably lower number of therapies. And as you make your criteria more stringent, so if you set up a two-zone device that begins at 200 beats per minute, then over the course of a year, you deliver more like 5 or 6% therapies. And the differences between that and that is likely largely due to inappropriate shocks or unnecessary shocks. And it's not that these people need all those therapies and are dying. Now, at the same time, this bottom line of two zones, VT greater than 200, there's only about 150 people in that, and there's about 15,000 people in this entire database. So it's a very select group of patients. One of the problems with querying this database is they know a lot about the device and what the device is seeing and doing, but they don't know really anything about the patient. So presumably those are young patients, maybe people with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, long QT syndrome, Dodd syndrome, things like that, who are appropriately programmed to a very high rate cutoff. That is not necessarily an appropriate way to program everyone's device. And if you look at the types of therapies that are delivered for these same individuals, you'll see that the blue bar is monomorphic GT, and then there's a light blue. But basically, the top three colors are appropriate therapies. So if you look at people who are getting treated in the range of, say, 170 and 180 beats per minute, about half of those are for fib and flutter. Another significant percentage are for sinus tachycardia. And really, a distinct minority of these therapies are appropriate therapies. And as you move in this direction, you have a higher incidence of appropriate therapies. So it might give you pause and say, well, gee, why are we programming all of these devices in this way and delivering all of these inappropriate therapies? And that's what I'm going to talk about, is how can we program these devices better. Now this is another interesting slide. This is data from Mike Sweeney out of Brigham, and there is considerable concern that shocks delivered through these devices may have adverse consequences for the patient, and not just beyond psychological, but also physiological and from a cardiac standpoint. And Dr. Sweeney looked into this in more detail than others, and I could spend the next 2 hours trying to sort out this area, which is really quite complicated, and it's complicated if you don't have great data and you really don't know the answer. But what he showed is that if you look at individuals who have VT or EF, that is seizure shock, their survival is different and clearly not as good as individuals who have no VT or EF. But it's also not as good as individuals who have VT or VF, but it's treated with ATP and they never receive a shock. And so there is a paradox, which is that a shock from an ICD is a presumably life-saving event that is also associated with increased mortality. And one possibility is that these people have progression of their underlying disease. The arrhythmia occurs as a marker of that increased risk, and that it's that underlying progression of disease which is the problem, which means that the ICD therapy is a marker of progression. And the other possibility is that the ICD shocks cause myocardial injury and lead to clinical deterioration and increased mortality rates, which means that the ICD therapy is a causal agent, and there may be more of one than the other in certain cases. There may be some combination of these. And there is, again, conflicting data which would both support and refute the idea that shocks are necessarily associated with a reduction in survival, but it's certainly an area of concern. What we do know about shocks is that they lead to increased healthcare utilization. They lead to ER visits, clinic visits, hospitalizations. Shocks can be proarrhythmic. I think everybody in the room that sees ICD patients has seen somebody with fib or flutter or sinus, atrial fib, atrial flutter, or sinus tachycardia, who received the shock, and that shock or ATP then induces a ventricular tachydysrhythmia, which requires more ATP or shocks, etc. There's certainly an impact in quality of life. I think in the years that I've been seeing ICD patients, I've had one patient who, this was back in the early days, he had had a number of sustained VT episodes, coming to the emergency room quite sick, getting shocked out in the ER, etc. He got his defibrillator, he got his first shock. He was so excited. He said, "Doc, this was amazing." I sit there and I was watching TV. I knew my heart had gone out of rhythm, and I knew how bad that was. 10 seconds later, I got a shock, and I was fine. That was awesome. I have not had any other patient who thought that it was awesome. Now, we've all seen the patients who come into the office and you see that they had a shock 3 months ago, and it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they don't remember it. And, I usually figure they were watching TV. They passed out for 5 seconds. Woke up and continued to watch the commercial and just didn't realize what had happened. But when people are aware of their shocks, they generally don't like them very much, and they certainly don't like them when they get multiple shocks. And so people who get shocked have lower quality of life. They can get depression, they can get post-traumatic stress disorder, and there are certainly patients who ask to get their device deactivated as a response to the stress of getting shocked. If you look at the SCUD study, and this was a primary prevention study, so these were patients who did not have arrhythmias. And there was 4 years of follow-up, during which time approximately a third of the patients received an ICD shock, and half of those shocks were inappropriate. And I believe that instead of folks were programmed for a single zone, no ACT, and that zone began around 182 beats per minute. So again, over the course of 4 years, 16% of people get appropriate therapy, 16% get inappropriate therapy. And so I would classify shocks as follows. Appropriate shocks are those that are delivered for what I put in quotes as sustained episodes of VT or VF, because sustained has to do with how you set up your duration criteria. Then there are appropriate but unnecessary shocks, and those are shocks that are delivered for VT or VF, but ATP could have terminated that episode and not a shock could have been avoided. Or the arrhythmia would have self-terminated if detection had been extended a little bit. And inappropriate shocks would be those delivered, probably going to miss something on this list, but sinus tachycardia, supraventricular arrhythmias, including fib, flutter, atrial tach, lead noise, fracture, T-wave oversensing, double counting. If you have a very wide QRS, the device may count each QRS twice. Once in a while, you'll have a big P-wave that will be sensed on the ventricular electrogram. You could get EMI from some external shock. And so this can be related to clinical issues, programming issues, technical issues. You know, every year, I have somebody who comes in and their device, to my mind, is programmed quite appropriately. But the typical story, which I've heard more than once remarkably, goes something like this. I went camping, and I forgot my beta blocker, and I didn't think that would be a problem. I wasn't going to turn around and go home and get it. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, this terrible thunderstorm strikes, and our campsite's getting flooded away, and the tent's falling down. And so I'm outside in the rain and the lightning and the thunder, and I'm working as hard as I can to keep this tent from blowing away. And all of a sudden, I get a shock. And, you know, it's like a Saturday Night Live or Monty Python skit or something like that. You just imagine the total chaos that's going on. But, you know, people do forget to take their beta blockers, and then they have sinus tachycardia in a range which you thought you had taken care of because they have relatively slow VT, and you're trying to keep their VT and their sinus tach from overlapping. And once in a while, that doesn't work out quite the way you'd like it to. You know, another thing that I see, I pick up a few patients every year and they're hypertropes or long QTs because they get a device and the device is appropriate, and it's left programmed out of the box. And the first time that this 22-year-old goes and exercises and they get the rate up to, you know, whatever rate is very physiologic for them, their device thinks it's VF, and they get shocked, and then they're pretty unhappy. And some of them are looking for a new doctor. And, you know, I'll reprogram them up to something that is appropriate for the type of arrhythmia they have in their age, and hopefully avoid additional inappropriate shock. So appropriate and unnecessary shocks. Short detection is a very major issue here, and then lack of appropriately programmed anti-tachycardia pacing. So how do we go about reducing shocks? Well, sometimes drugs are appropriate. We want to slow down the sinus node. We want to slow conduction through the AV node for atrial fib or atrial flutter, or we want to use a membrane-active drug to try and reduce the true ventricular tachyarrhythmias orthopedic arrhythmias, or we want to use membrane-active drugs to at least slow a PT to a point where, rather than requiring shock, that it is manageable through antitachycardia pacing. We can do ablation. You can ablate fib, you can ablate flutter, you can ablate the AP node, various SVTs, and obviously you can ablate ventricular tachycardia. You want to have an appropriate rate cutoff, and that may be different for a primary prevention patient versus a secondary prevention patient. In general, the arrhythmias that primary prevention patients have are much faster than the arrhythmias that you might see in a secondary prevention patient. You can extend detection to avoid treatment of non-sustained arrhythmias, brief little episodes of noise that might come up on the lead. You can use tiered therapy. There are SVT discriminators, and then the companies can build better sensing circuits. One of the most difficult things to deal with is T-wave oversensing. It's not very common, but it does occur, and when it occurs, it's a pretty nasty problem to deal with. But for those of us who go to the lab or work in the lab, we filter out the T-wave very easily in the electrophysiology lab, and the device companies are just beginning, I think really within about the last 6 months, at least 2 of the major manufacturers have changed their sensing circuits to try and make them better at eliminating the T-wave oversensing. Because again, when you sense the T-wave and your heart rate's 90, you're all of a sudden the device thinks your heart rate's 180, and if you've got detection programmed at 200 beats per minute, you're still okay. So that means as soon as the heart rate gets to 101, the device thinks it's 202, and you start getting some fire alarms. And I'm going to pick on St. Jude a little bit, not because they're either better or worse necessarily in this regard than other companies, but because I had ready access to a comparative set of data on how their devices work. And so if you program a St. Jude device to 3 zones, which is what we almost always do in our center, out of the box, until very recently, a St. Jude device was set for 12 intervals in the BT zone at 139 beats per minute. Now that's a very short detection, and it's really, really slow. Clearly, and the company doesn't want you to leave the program out of the box and have somebody die because it misses an arrhythmia. But it means if you leave a program out of the box, if you go back to the pretty colored slide from the altitude study, you're going to get a ton of inappropriate therapies in the average patient who would be programmed like that. So they've taken a bold step and they've gone to 18 at 150, still a very slow rate, and that 18 is not a huge number, especially for a rate of 150 beats per minute. BT2 has gone from 12 at 160 to 16 at 181. VF remains at 12 intervals. The rate's gone from 181 to 214. They have opened up a little bit of a fast BT zone in there. If you have a St. Jude device programmed for 1 zone, it used to be 12 intervals at 167 beats per minute. It's now 12 intervals at 187 beats per minute. So again, they've made some changes, but I would argue those changes probably fall short of what I would like to see, and I think that this is similar to what the other companies have done. Again, I just want to remind you about this slide. When you're leaving people with treatment at 140, 50, 60 beats per minute, depending on the individual patient, you're going to get a lot of inappropriate therapies. So let's look at tiered therapy. Again, what we usually do is program people to 3 zones. And Historically, what we've kind of done is 220 minus the age, which would give you your maximum predicted heart rate per age, and then you add about 10 beats per minute. So that works pretty well for your younger patients, but when you have an 85-year-old, it brings that rate down too far. So I would suggest that probably a minimum rate would be 170 beats per minute, or maybe a little more. Again, that would depend on primary prevention versus a secondary prevention. If somebody has known sustained VT, you typically want to program 10 to 20 beats per minute slower than their known sustained VT. I think one of the things that I see pretty commonly is that somebody gets a defibrillator, they're sitting around on telemetry, they have 10 or 12 or 15 beats of non-sustained VT at 135 beats per minute, which is completely asymptomatic, and I wouldn't think of any clinical significance whatsoever, but somebody will come by and say, oh my gosh, I don't want to miss that. They're programmed for detection at 130 beats per minute. Patient goes home within 2 weeks, has inappropriate therapy. For VT2, a fast VT zone, the low end of that, again, depending on the patient, probably somewhere in the 190 to 210 or 315 beats per minute range, and then the true VF zone would be in the 240 to 250 beats per minute range. Again, when you have the relatively unusual subset of patients, you have young, healthy patients with things like long QT, who've got a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. These people aren't really getting sustained VT at 180 beats per minute. You're really worried about VF in these people. You're worried about very fast arrhythmias. And you want to program them to high rate cutoffs and relatively longer durations. So let's talk a little bit about what kind of duration is appropriate for detection. And Medtronic has sponsored a number of studies in this regard. And so they started with the pain-free trial, and at this time, their out-of-the-box programming was 12 of 16 intervals, and this was mixed primary and secondary prevention. And they noted that 1.5% of what the device called VF terminated spontaneously. They went to the pain-free 2 trial, and they extended detection to 18 of 24. And what they noted was 34% of fast VTs were self-terminating. So there was a lot of stuff that people were getting treated for in the pain-free trial that just went away without any clinical sequelae if you just extended detection from 12 to 16 to 18 or 24. And in the PROPARE trial, which was a primary prevention set of patients, so these were people who did not have prior arrhythmias, they extended detections out to 30 of 40, and there was a 50% shock reduction in the first year. It was 9% versus 17%. Now there's flaws here to say these historical controls, but in going back through these patients, there was one patient who had sustained VT that was below detection and below the rate cutoff state program. It took me 2 or 3 minutes to speed up and get to a shock. But aside from that one individual, what they did is basically say, dozens and dozens of inappropriate shocks. And the feeling was that overall this was a more appropriate way to program devices. Again, there's less data available for St. Jude or Boston Scientific devices, but the nominal settings for those companies are relatively short. St. Jude has actually extended them a little from the 12. And Boston Scientific has another beta study coming out looking at high rate cutoffs and longer detection delays. So I would say, again, the trouble is that every company is a little different. Medtronic uses probabilistic things, so they're looking for 18 out of 24 or 30 out of 40, something like that. The other companies, they may, the counters may go increment and decrement, they may require consecutive counts, so there are some variations in how these work. And you can't necessarily take data from one company's study and know that that translates exactly to another company. So you have to think through all these things very carefully. But the bottom line is we should use longer durations. The PROVE trial is the St. Jude trial. They looked at the benefit of ATP in primary prevention ICD patients. And basically what they found is whether it's fast VT or slow VT, that you could terminate the vast majority of these with ATP. We used to be more concerned that if you use ATP on faster VTs, that you accelerate them and then turn them into something that would be hemodynamically less stable and of longer duration and more difficult to terminate. I think we've shown that we should be using ATP at rapid rates up to at least 240 or 250 beats per minute. So what should we do in terms of curative therapy? I recommend multiple ATPs for slower VT, at least one ATP sequence for VTs between 188 and 250 beats per minute. And what's been used typically is one burst, 8 pulses, 88% of the fast VT cycle length. I would consider adding a second burst that's 10 milliseconds faster. You can use ATP during charging in the VF zone, but there's companies that allow it, and not all of the technology does. SVT discriminators, in any device, there is onset, stability, QRS morphology, and high rate timers. And with the dual chamber ICDs, where you have an A lead, you can look at VA relationships. So onset is supposed to be helpful in discriminating sinus attack from ventricular tachycardia, but it can be problematic if you have somebody who has exercise-induced VT and they go from sinus attack to VT. Onset can keep you from treating something that you want. And it can also be problematic with dual tachycardia if somebody goes into AFib with rapid ventricular response and then develops VT. So in general, onset is probably not a great thing to use. Stability is helpful to distinguish AFib from VT. RR intervals in AFib are usually more variable than they are at VT. But the faster AFib gets, the more regular it tends to become. So basically, if rates are over 200 and not that much AFib, but over 200 beats per minute. So generally, if rates are over 200 beats per minute, those discriminators are no longer operative. Morphology basically can help you look at changes in the QRS morphology. This is based on either a near field or far field ventricular electrogram, and it's a pretty good discriminator. And then there are high rate timers. And each company has their own little name for those, but it's basically a safety feature. So what it says is that if you have something in the VT range, but it's meeting one of your SVT criteria and the device is holding off on therapy, if the arrhythmia lasts a certain amount of time, how long is that before the device says, to heck with the discriminators, I just want to treat? And normally those are set pretty darn short. They're set for a few seconds. And I think it's probably more appropriate either to keep that one off or to set it out for, say, 5 minutes, something that's very long. If you have a dual chamber device, if you've got more B's than A's, if you've got VT with VA block, if your atrial rate is slow, that's ventricular tachycardia. If you've got one-to-one retrograde conduction, it requires some more complicated algorithms. You can't have AFib and VT at the same time, so there are a variety of different programming algorithms. Medtronic calls it PR logic, St. Jude calls it Great Branch, and generally those are pretty good. Once in a while they can get fooled. You need to think about what specific problems your patient may have. Again, if you look at various data and what's the risk of under-recognizing arrhythmia, with the onset discriminator, it can be as high as 5%, which is why I say it's not great. The stability discriminator is really pretty good. The morphology discriminator is pretty good. If you have something that's under-detected, it will probably eventually accelerate and be detected. Not that that's a great way to treat your patient, but I think the question is, you'll take one of those for avoiding how many tens of shocks. Under detection in the PF zone due to discriminators isn't an issue because wherever you program your PF zone, the SVT discriminators are not often. So, again, treating SVT as VT is the most common cause of an inappropriate shock. So getting your discriminators on can markedly reduce inappropriate shocks. We get more inappropriate shocks in people with secondary prevention because they have slower arrhythmias. So you just have to be more careful in programming these devices. And so generally, though, I would say that these discriminators should be on for rates up to 200 beats per minute, and Medtronic's looking at putting them on faster. I think I'm running over. So I think we've pretty much gone through this stuff. But I think we need to change the way we look at an ICD and look at it primarily as a device for ATP with occasional backup defibrillation, rather than looking at it as a shock box that occasionally can pace somebody out of control.